Hello friends, it's your boy, Jenkins Dota, and I'm bringing you another Dota 2 video in which we're going to be taking a look at some item builds. So what I want to do is essentially just take a look at a couple of games from the Chongqing Major. I don't want to actually go into the replays, I've seen the games, and I just want to cover why I think some of these offlaners made specific item choices. And I'm hoping that the decision-making process that these guys use to make these choices in terms of items can be extended to the other roles, but the reason that I'm sticking to the offlane role is because that's the role that I'm comfortable with. So the reason for making this video is just because Donnie and I have essentially been playing with a new Dota player, a friend of ours, and he's been asking a lot of questions about items. So it just kind of dawned on me this is one of the more confusing topics in Dota, and I wanted to make this video as a result. So in any case, we have Chalice here. This is a game between LGD and Fnatic. LGD won. This is the lower bracket. They eliminated Fnatic, spoiler alert, but Chalice played very well in this game, in a very difficult game. So he starts off with 6 tangos, 1 healing salve, enchanted mango, and then stout shield. You might be wondering, why did he not go for the 3 mango build and then 6 tango build, which is kind of the common Sven starting items right now. And the reason that he chose not to go for that and instead opted to go for a healing salve instead and not going for a bunch of mangoes is because he knew that given this draft and given this draft, he would be laning against a Razor. And this is not always something that you can figure out in your pubs, but essentially this is something that LGD talked about. They knew that the Razor was going to... It would essentially be a disaster if the Razor was laning into the Jug, and then if the Panda was laning into the Sven. This would be 2 winning side lanes, so they were just like, okay, we're going to sack the Sven. This is a lane where if he's just doing okay and getting farm against a Razor who is supposed to counter him, he's having a good time. So he goes for more HP regen. And we can see here that he goes for a Quelling Blade first instead of Boots, and you might also be wondering, like, why wouldn't you go Boots first against a Razor? You know this hero, he just sucks you, runs after you, and if you have low movement speed, he just deals a ton of damage, so why wouldn't you go Boots first? The reason for this is because in this game, LGD had Sven in the safe lane. In order to dodge the Jug so that he's not laning into the Razor, the Sven was safe lane. So because of this, essentially, Chalice knows that he's going to be playing mostly in his tower because that's just where the creeps start in terms of the equilibrium, and then also you have the easy camp to work with to pull back. So the boots aren't really that necessary because he's just able to run into his tower. However, they of course are necessary at some point, so he goes for them second. But in a lot of games, you would actually go for boots first against the Razor, just because this hero, of course, he gets the boots first as well. This hero just runs after you, and more movement speed means he gets more damage. So we can see that the very first item that Chalice builds into, the very first item that he's building into is the Vlads. Essentially the reasoning for that is just because that item is ubiquitously broken right now. There's no like grandiose reason that he's going for the Vlads first. It's not some crazy decision making. It's literally just the item is incredibly strong. But the build up is very important. So he builds into a Ring of Basilius, and a lot of the time you'd actually see offlaners go for Basilius, Headdress, then for Phase Boots. Or you build into the whole Vlads before you go for Phase Boots. But in this game, he needed the Phase Boots to outrun the Razor. So he essentially went for that. And the Basilius, going for the Basilius first over the Headdress, is essentially deciding that the mana regen is more important than the HP regen. Which I definitely agree with in this particular game. They were fighting a lot. He was using the stun a lot, and he felt like he needed the mana. Then he goes, of course, for the Vlads. Like I said, that's a very, very strong item. The first thing that he had in his quick buy after this was a Force Staff because the Razor was a huge problem for him. And I noticed watching this game that his camera positioning was almost always... He was, number one, when he was going into fights, when he did have the Blink Dagger eventually, he was looking for the Panda. And then number 2, he would have his camera watching his Juggernaut. So essentially this entire draft is based around Magnus and Power, and then empowering the Juggernaut, and he does a lot of damage. So the Force Staff, I think, was essentially an item decision where it's like he knows that the Shadow Shaman is going to stun somebody, which is single target. The Razor is going to suck on them, and then they're going to do a bunch of damage with the OD and the Razor. And if he can force that target away, namely the Juggernaut, away, then Jug can turn and do all of his damage with the Magnus. Because, you know, his camera positioning was constantly looking at the Jug, looking to save the Jug. So that's why I think he had the Force Staff in his quick buy. But essentially some stuff happened in the game, and it felt like they needed some sort of initiation at this point. It felt like they needed somebody to start the fights. It couldn't be Queen of Pain. He was dying too quickly. It needed to be him. So he goes for the Blink Dagger instead of the Force Staff, because while the Force Staff would help him in the fights, they needed somebody to start the fights that wasn't just them losing somebody right off the bat. For instance, if you were Sven in another game, you might go Crimson Guard first, run in, and just bait, and that's how you start the fight, and you don't actually maybe need a Blink Dagger in that game. And that's fine, because that's your job. You're essentially getting an item that helps you do your job better. He's just being tanky. That would also make him tanky for during the fights, not only for starting the fights. But in this game, there's too much damage on the enemy team. If he tries to, against these heroes, run in and start the fight that way, he'll die. And he did, and that's when he queued the Blink Dagger up next. So after the Blink Dagger, he builds into a Plate Mail, which is going to build into an eventual Lotus Orb. This is very similar to the Force Staff in his quick buy that he wanted to buy. Essentially, there's a bunch of single target on Fnatic. He had his camera constantly positioned on trying to save the Juggernaut. Essentially, he just all that they needed to do was keep the Panda CC'd, which with the Blink Dagger he can do that, and then save the Juggernaut so he can just turn around and Omni Slash with Empower on. So that's why the Lotus Orb is there. It's the exact same reasoning as the Force Staff. He's literally just trying to save his Juggernaut, who the entire draft is built around. And you can see he does eventually build into the Force Staff. It's the exact same thing. So many times in this game, he would Lotus Orb the Jug and then Force Staff the Jug away. They'd turn the fight with an RP, and then Jug would go in and use his Omni Slash. So essentially, his entire item build was just based around saving the Jug. So here we have a second replay. This is Evil Geniuses versus eHome, where EG knocked out eHome. And before we get into it, I do want to cover something that personally really helped me in terms of making good item choices. Essentially, if you don't know what item to go for, just picture yourself as being on the enemy team. In particular, if you can figure out the enemy team's win condition, and imagine that you're that hero, and you're looking at what your hero actually is on the enemy team, as if you're them, what would piss you off the most to see your hero get on the enemy team, assuming somebody else is playing it? And in general, when it comes to Dota, it's a lot of the negative things that we remember. It's a lot of the emotional things that we remember, because it's a very instinctive game. It's very complicated. It's very emotional. So when you think about things like that, a lot of the time you'll immediately think, if that hero had a Ghost Scepter, I'd be fucked. If I was the OD and this hero had a Ghost Scepter, he couldn't do anything. Like, there's always that one item, and it generally tends to be like your Ghost Scepters, your BKBs, your Glimmer Capes, your Force Staffs, your boring items, because those ones tend to be the ones that, if you don't go for them, you would lose the game. But the reason you wouldn't go for them is because they're kind of boring items, and that's really why that thought process helps a lot, is because it will help you avoid not making shitty item decisions. It might not help you make good ones, but you won't make shitty ones anymore, and that personally really helped me. But in this game, we have S4, and he built starting items: Quelling Blade, Stout Shield, Healing Salve, Tango. And you may be thinking, why does he have a Quelling Blade? The reason for this is because he knew he'd be against a tri-lane, and he was playing safe lane Doom. RTZ actually went to the off lane with his supports, so they were dodging, and as a result, he has a Quelling Blade to last under a tower, to build himself these like little juke paths, which he was doing in the game. And of course, he's a Doombringer, so he naturally has that Devour regen. So he doesn't need a bunch of regen, a bunch of tangos. He's not going to apply any pressure with mangoes and casting spells, because he's against a tri-lane. So that's why he went for the Quelling Blade first. And of course, you can't get to the side shop if you're playing a safe lane Doom against a tri-lane. They're just going to sit there and defend it and kill you if you go for it. But then, as I mentioned in the previous clip, he builds Headdress and Basilius, because these are just incredibly efficient items to have in your inventory. Even sending out the courier for Basilius, sending it back, getting a Headdress is going to be worth it, because there's just such good items. Builds into the Vlads. It's incredibly good with the Terrorblade this game, and in general, like I said, it's just a ubiquitously broken item. And then he builds into the Gloves of Haste, opting to go for the attack speed component instead of the armor, because he was kind of hitting creeps more, and playing in the off lane, just kind of playing a farming role. And then builds into the phase boots for a little bit of mobility. Going for Tranquils would be probably acceptable as well, but this armor item tends to be a lot better if you build into like a Vlad's or any other sort of like lifesteal or HP regen. You don't need the Tranquil Boots regen, and then at that point you probably just want the armor. So eventually he builds into a first kind of big item after Vlad's phase boots, Blink. And the reason that he went for the Blink in this game is because he looked at this game and saw that there's a Juggernaut, there's an OD, if he dooms either of these targets, he would doom the Jug, because if the Jug doesn't have Omni Slash and he dooms them, that's going to be a one fight, because there's absolutely no way that these guys win a fight without the Omni Slash. It's just too important, especially with how much farm he's going to have on him. So if he can doom the Jug before the Omni, it's very important. It's also important to doom the Jug if he wants to actually kill somebody with the doom, because otherwise the Jug will just use Healing Ward on the target that gets doomed. Or he can doom the OD and fight everybody else, because the OD just doesn't do anything, doesn't do any damage with the Doom, and essentially the Doom can be used. It won't kill the OD, because the Jug will just heal him with the Healing Ward, but it will allow essentially allow the EG lineup to fight into the OD without having to worry about his damage, Sanity's Eclipse, etc. And then it'll just be 1v5 after they kill the whole team, and the OD can die afterwards. So essentially there's like two ways that they can win the fight, but really it all comes down to positioning with this Blink, and I think if they don't doom either of these targets, they don't win the fight. After that, he builds into a first item BKB, and this is kind of why I mentioned that little way of thinking at the start of this clip. He built a BKB, and it's kind of a boring item choice in this game, and maybe you'd go for a Radiance, maybe you'd go for an Octarine Core, an Aghanim Scepter, or any of these items, but essentially he recognized what his job was in this game, and that is essentially to just doom one of these two targets. And with the Blink Dagger, he has the positioning element, but he could still get CC'd by either of these two support heroes, or he could get imprisoned by the OD. And the Blacking Bar is essentially going to allow him to scot-free get away with dooming one of these targets. He just uses BKB, blinks in, and dooms one of these two targets. Essentially, he just recognizes what his job is and is going to do it as best as he can. And because his job is important enough and strong enough in this game that they'll essentially just win the fight. If he does his job, he just commits fully to doing it and goes for the BKB. Maybe even a Shadow Blade after this, if the game continued, would be a good item pickup, or a Force Staff, or even a goddamn Ether Lens, if it results in doing the job well, if the job is going to essentially win the game. But his job in this game, if they didn't have these damage heroes, if they had CC already, if they had a Lion, for example, if they had a Shadow Shaman, for example, who had a Blink, who was doing a lot of initiating, maybe S4 instead would go for a Radiance to do damage. If they already had damage, maybe he'd go for a Midas to build as many auras as he can for the late game. It just depends on what you think your job is in the game, essentially, and whatever's going to help you do that the best. So that's it for this video. Apologies for only doing 2 builds in this video. I wanted to go into great detail with the item choices just because this is a hot topic. It's something that pro players argue about all the time, like, this hero can't build this item is so good on this hero, you have to get it every game. It's a really deep topic, essentially, so I didn't want to just skim over the details, essentially. But if you think there's a better way of doing this, if you want to see more of it, like whatever your thoughts are on this video, I would really appreciate it, because we haven't really done anything like this before, but it's something that I really felt like I wanted to talk about. So in any case, thank you for watching. I do appreciate it, and I hope to see you guys in another video.